a chip, take a dip. It's time to feed your brain. We got the myths, we got the legends. It's spicy and it's true. It's Guess So You Didn't Know.
Hello, everybody out there in this big, beautiful world. This is the Queso You Didn't Know show. I am your host, Queso, and joining me as always is your lovable co-host.
Toberto Simpson, hey, hey, and
Ev-
hey.
and hey indeed. Everybody out there listening today, I think you're going to really enjoy this one. We're continuing our Rebels and Revolutionary series, and we're moving from the Stano Rebellion and the South Carolinas to a beautiful, beautiful little place nestled in the little heart of Louisiana. Where am I talking about? Today we're talking on the single largest slave revolt in the history of the United States. And I'm willing to bet that 90% of the people listening right now have never heard of it. We know Nat Turner, we know John Brown, but we don't know the German uprising of 1811. Why? Because Nat Turner was a religious vision, a tragedy in a small Virginia county. The German Coast Uprising was a war. It was highly organized. It was a uniformed offensive that aimed to capture New Orleans, overthrow the U.S. territorial government, and establish a black republic on the banks of the Mississippi. It was so terrifying to the American establishment that they didn't just crush it, they effectively deleted it from the national memory. We're dropping into the Louisiana Territory right around the time of January 1811. Now, don't let the name German Coast fool you. It's not in Berlin. It's the stretch of the Mississippi River about 30 miles upstream from New Orleans, modern-day St. John the Baptist and St. Charles parishes. It got its name because some early German settlers in the 1700s, but by 1811, this place was the Sugar Bowl of the North America. A few years earlier, a guy named Etienne Boré had discovered how to granulate sugar on an industrial scale. Suddenly, this region went from a sleepy backwater to a gold rush. Sugar is brutal, though. It's arguably, as you learn in the Haitian Revolution episode, I'm sure, the most labor intensive, dangerous crop on earth. To fuel this boom, the planters imported thousands of enslaved people, not just from Africa. They were bringing them from the Upper South, mainly Virginia and Maryland, because the international slave trade had officially ended in 1808. And I say that with huge air quotes around ended. This created a unique demographic pressure cooker, very similar to Stano. You had a hyper accelerated system of labor exploitation sitting right next to a politically unstable territory that the U.S. had just bought from France in 1803. The French planters hated the American governor. The American governor didn't trust the French militia. And underneath them all was a massive growing population of enslaved men who were being worked to death in the cane fields. It wasn't a matter of if it would blow up, it was a matter of when.
It's kind of similar in that regard to our last story, as far as it's not a matter of if, but when. You know what I mean? There's going to be some type of pressure cooker, but nice little distinction because I for sure thought that we were taking a trip over to Europe this time around, but apparently not. So, good news. Well, not necessarily good news, but surprising news, I'll say at the very least. And overall, this is right up there with the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre as far as just hidden gems in history.
Without a doubt. And we will be covering Tulsa in the future, ladies and gentlemen. Don't you forget it. Set your timers. We'll let you know when that one's ready. But today, I will say, you start seeing a lot of world history bleed into this story too, because if it wasn't for the Haitian Revolution, this one would have never happened. It really is just a matter of all these different factors coming together. And it is a hidden gem, you know? I think to a degree, Stano was a hidden gem too. And, I'm glad we get to bring these kind of stories to the forefront because the one thing I really love doing in the research is learning about something I had no idea about. And if I'm being quite honest, I didn't know about last week's topic any more than I knew about this week's topic before I started researching it.
Oh yeah.
I just go out, man, and literally I'll hop on the computer or I'll hop on AI and be like, give me a list of things I may not have known about Black history, about Latin history, about Hispanic history, about Asian history. And it gives me some gems, it gives me names, and then I go and dig into them to learn what I can. And this was a really big part of that I was like, well, we have Haiti. We have Fred Hampton. What else can we do in our Rebels series? And it's like, oh, okay, I wanted to hit the ones that people haven't heard of because, and you've shown this last week, Nat Turner, and most people know Nat Turner, but they don't necessarily know the Stano Rebellion or the German or the German Coast Uprising.
Oh yeah. And it shows why a lot of slaveholders were on edge because Nat Turner was a lot of things, but he was not an anomaly. There were a lot of Nat Turners, so to speak, and they kept a lot of slaveholders up at night, more or less. But kind of our little tidbit before we break off is what do you think that there's the fact that there's been a trail of time documenting bad blood between France and America is spoken on enough or acknowledged enough?
I think it is, and I think when you look at it in the bigger context of things, I think even when we became American, we still had English sympathies, whether we wanted to admit it or not. And I think you see a lot of that playing into that's why we had the 7 Years' War. That's why you start looking at the purchasing of the Louisiana Purchase from France. It wasn't all golden showers and such forth, so to speak. So I think it is something that you definitely see popping up a lot in history, and I think it will definitely play a part here. And maybe that's why too that they said, "Hey, you lost Haiti, and now we got people in Louisiana trying to do the same thing. We don't like it." I don't know.
Uh, yeah, I will say that overall, you're right. You're right on that because daily life in Elizabethan England, that's a little ditty of a book that's it's just shaped me up into so many ways into realizing that a country or a nation, it's always going to be in one way or another just a reflection of the nation that preceded it, that quote unquote was under its thumb before it in one way or another, and in so many ways, what they did in English culture around those times is reflective of how we live in America to this day. We're still in one way or another, just little Britain.
Very much so. And you'll see that same type of one begatting the other in a way, so to speak, with this microcosm in history. That one of the reasons this revolt is usually just dismissed as a riot in older history books is people assume it was spontaneous. Just a mob that got angry. But that is completely false. You'll start seeing it was a conspiracy that took months, maybe a year to plan. The mastermind was a man named Charles Deslandes. Deslandes is a fascinating figure. He wasn't a field hand, he was a driver, an overseer. Now, the driver is a complicated figure in slavery. They were enslaved men who were given authority over other enslaved men. They carried whips. They were often very hated. But they also had mobility. They could travel between plantations. They could carry messages without raising suspicion. And Deslandes used his privilege to build an army right under the nose of the white planters. History sometimes calls them free or mixed race, but the documents show he was enslaved. However, he was smart, he was charismatic, and more importantly, he had access to news, specifically news from Haiti. Remember, and we covered this, people. Go check your notes on our old podcasts because the Haitian Revolution, which took place from 1791 to 1804, had just succeeded. Deslandes knew that enslaved people could win. He wasn't planning a protest, he was planning a Haitian Revolution 2.0. But Deslandes knew he couldn't do it alone, with just Creole slaves, those born in the colonies. He needed heavy hitters. Enter the two lieutenants he recruited, named Cook and Kwamana. These men were African born, specifically, they were Akan. This is the same ethnic group involved in the Stano rebellion we talked about. The Akan from the Asante Kingdom in modern Ghana were a warrior culture. In the chaos of West African wars, many actual generals and officers were captured and sold to America. So you have this brilliant tactical alliance. Deslandes, the Creole politician and organizer, uniting with Cook and Kwamana, the African combat veterans. They bridged the cultural divide between the American slaves and the African slaves to create a unified fighting force.
Hmm. Yeah, decent stuff. And overall, I think, well, one little tidbit that I picked up from that, I couldn't help but acknowledge that it's kind of depressing to a certain degree knowing that there were people who I'm sure in one society ranked pretty high, but thanks to the transatlantic slave trade, they were flung over to America or whatever and just brought down to such a low level. It's a hell of a thought.
It
But
really is that you went from being a general that led armies of men to being property, basically. Yeah, it is. You're right, man. Oh,
yeah, definitely. And overall, I I just think that it took a lot of guts for this guy to do what he did to rise to the level of a high-ranking soldier, of a high-ranking member of a certain society, so to speak, and to use that against them. Because he could have been killed for it, obviously, and he was closer in rank, closer in communication with them. So if they noticed something, they could have, you know, easily could have potentially noticed something and killed him for it. And just overall, because of course most people wouldn't want to risk that. They just would just want to, or you would think that most people would want to just, they wouldn't want to risk that and live a life of comfort, just comfortable, so to speak, servitude. And the fact that he didn't says a lot. And it also says a lot because he could withstand to be within that and still carry out what was necessary to liberate people and just keep the mental stability. And I say that because if you look at a lot of records from those times, the runaway slaves, they would never be, or at least very rarely, be people who were low level slaves, so to speak. They would never be field hands and no shit like that. They would always be high ranking, so to speak, slaves. And if you think about it, a lot of that has to be because they were in such direct contact with their slaveholders, so they saw a certain level of evil from a front row seat. So it was just horrifying, you know?
well, and then I have to imagine it doesn't hurt either if you're higher up to have the schedule of the piece of shit that you're working under, right? That not only are you seeing this cruelty up close, but you also know, okay, for the next week, the man of the house is going to be gone, and all his, best men are going to be gone with him hunting and shit. So this would be the time to leave.
Yeah. And just overall, because that was just the glass ceiling, you know? After you reached a certain level in the slave on the plantation, it's like at the end of the day, like the Jay-Z song says, still nigga. So you can only go so far. So that's your glass ceiling. So once you reach that, it's like, fuck, I can't, I'm only going to go so far here. So why not break free and run loose? But if you're a field hand or some stuff, like that's a, that's the next step on the elevator.
Fair enough, fair enough. And I'm sure it takes time to be able to get away like that, you know. And timing really is everything. And you'll see that in this story that the timing for this uprising was actually quite impeccable. They picked January 8th, 1811. And why did they pick January? Because the grinding season or the sugar harvest had just ended. The enslaved men were exhausted, yes, but they were also at their physical peak from the hard labor. More importantly, see, and this is kind of playing into what I was suspecting here earlier with why certain slaves would escape a little easier than others. They knew that it was the start of carnival season for the whites. What did that mean? The planters were partying. They were visiting each other's houses. They were drinking, dancing, and generally letting their guard down. The social calendar was full, and the surveillance was lax. The target for the initial strike was the Andre plantation. This wasn't random. Manuel Andre wasn't just a rich planter. He was the commander of the local militia. He controlled the weapons, and the rebels knew step one is to neutralize the military command. In the pouring rain on the night of January 8th, Deslandes and his inner circle storm Andre's mansion. What happens next? They attack Manuel Andre with an axe. They wound him severely. But, and this is the movie moment where the plot twists, Andre doesn't die. He manages to slip away in the chaos, fleeing into the swamp or jumping into the river to reach a canoe. Either way, he crosses the Mississippi to raise the alarm. This was a disaster for the rebels, and they knew it. The clock had just started ticking. However, they do kill his son Gilbert Andre. And most importantly, they break into the basement storehouse. They seize the weapons cache kept there, full of muskets, ammunition, and I'd say even more importantly, uniforms. This is crucial. When they march out of the house, Deslandes puts on a militia uniform. His lieutenants put on epaulettes and belts. This sent a massive psychological message. They were no longer runaways. They were the new authority.
That's a hell of a way to put it. That's a hell of a way to put it. What do you think about the psychological part of it?
Well, I think it helps unify them and it helps them see themselves as something more. They realize when they have the uniforms on that, see, we're not slaves, we are military men. We are soldiers and we know what we're doing. And more importantly, it puts a message out to everyone in the surrounding area, white, black, or any other color in between. It shows we are the military. We are an army. Fuck with us or get killed. You know, essentially, that I think it puts a psychological fear in your enemy when they actually see you in uniforms and not a hodgepodge mix of different fabrics and colors.
Yeah, yeah, I get that. That that says something, and just a little side note as I always do, that plays into just destroying the whole mindset of nothing matters, everything means something, and even down to wearing matching uniforms, that says a lot. Like, I ain't gonna lie. I see a bunch of dudes walk up, like just walk around. You see a bunch of motherfuckers back when people actually went to the mall, like every once in a while you see a bunch of dudes dressed up to in matching uniforms, matching outfits. And it's like, okay, what these motherfuckers up to? Like, it sends a message, you know?
Exactly, exactly. And it unifies you in a way that people like to think they're smarter than psychology and they go, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. That's dumb. But no, it really does. Even if it does seem dumb, exactly, it makes sense that it has an aura about it. Exactly. You can call it, if you want to get esoteric, maybe it's a form of magic thought that the uniform does hold certain magic qualities to it that it puts you in a specific mindset.
Yeah, for a fact, for a fact. That's kind of similar to how people say you can say that you don't do politics or whatever, but politics will still do you, or you can say that you're not interested in politics, but politics is definitely interested in you. Like you can say you're not interested in psychological shit and stuff like that, but it's still going to have some type of effect on you and your life. So, you know, might as well take heed to certain things. But
Exactly. It's better to understand how your mind works than to doubt it.
yeah, for real. And just overall, what do you think it says that he he had to just a certain mindset about continuing on with the good fight after your son of all people dies?
I think it tells a lot that he ran out of there before his son was killed. That's what came up in my research. I think it's a perfect example of, honestly, what I would call, in the simplest terms, a scared little bully that didn't want to face the music. And he wasn't looking for his son. He was running the hell out. He wasn't running out to be brave to call for help. He was running out to call for help because he knew the only way he could pretend to even be slightly heroic was by crushing this with overwhelming numbers.
Well, ain't that a bit?
I'm just saying.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, especially considering the fact that you actually have one. I mean, I can see how you can take that personally to a certain degree or another.
And you'll start to see the difference in the cowardice of this man and the bravery in the men leading this new army. Because at this point, Manuel Andre is literally paddling for his life across the river, bleeding from an axe wound. But back on the river road where our boys are, the rebellion is now entering phase two. They start marching downriver toward New Orleans, which I thought you'd appreciate given our last episode. Their slogan is simple and terrifying: freedom or death. Although some sources say it was on to New Orleans, but come on, we all know it's freedom or death. That's the movie tag right there. As they hit each plantation, they're not just burning it, they recruit. They start with a core group of maybe 25 men, but by the time they're moving down the road, estimates range that they were built up to anywhere between 200 to 500 soldiers. And again, I use the word soldiers deliberately. White eyewitnesses, even the ones who hated them, reported that this didn't look like a riot. It looked like a military parade. They marched in formation two by two. They had officers on horseback. This would be Deslandes and his lieutenants. They carried flags. Some reports say they had a specific banner inspired by Haitian colors. And most importantly, they had drums. I know we talked about drums on Stano, but it bears repeating. In African warfare, the drum is the radio. It coordinates movement, it keeps morale high, and it intimidates the enemy. Imagine being a plantation owner sitting on your porch and hearing the thunder of drums coming down the river road, seeing columns of black men in militia uniforms carrying muskets and cane knives. The white population went into total primal panic. They fled into the swamps, they jumped into boats to escape, the rebels controlled the road, and they were clearing the path to the capital.
Yeah. Like I said, man, some slaveholders were definitely kept up at night due to certain shit like this. And I'm sure through the vision of you know, white slave, not just slaveholders, but overall lots of white society at the time, seeing some shit like that through their perspective, it was definitely some shit out of a horror flick.
For them, I'm sure it was the scariest thing you could ever imagine happening. Oh no, the people we oppressed are rising against us. Yeah.
Yeah, it was it was it was definitely that. Talk about some. commando elite type shit. Just overall, it can be looked at as one of the many things that I'll say shows the humanity of slaves, that especially since it was always just threatened the perspective of their humanity, just how disciplined they were.
And you really see this throughout this story that people hear slave rebellions and they don't realize like these men were soldiers. There may have been some that were born on the plantation, but more so than anything, these men were soldiers. And I think that's lost a lot in translation. Like that there were men, like you said, that had autonomy and things before this happened on a level that some of the other men they were fighting next to may not have ever even been able to fathom.
Oh yeah. It's one of those, it's a true you just had to be there moment. Because to be somebody who came from that society, like imagine you were probably uh, a high ranking military soldier, or probably a high ranking member of a court system of some sort, and you come back and you're standing next to somebody, you're sitting next to somebody who looks just like you, who spent all their life as a slave in America, and probably their parents have too, and you have nothing in common with them, so to speak. Like you lived a totally different life than them. Like that's a true you had to be there moment just to see how, just to feel the distance between those two worlds.
And like you said, the discipline they had as soldiers, but then that humanity too as well, that you sit back and you can understand because let's be honest, there's a lot of motherfuckers out there that couldn't work for shit when it comes to trying to find a common goal or achieve a common goal. But as you said, these are men that could have been basically kings or queens of where they came from now enslaved with a person that was enslaved for generations, and they can still come together and agree that we have to do this for our greater good.
Mm-hmm. Cause, and this is true, you had to be there moment, not just because of the feeling, but I'm sure in some cases, or probably lots of cases, like imagine the conversations between those guys, like a guy coming from Africa, probably a high-ranking member of that society, talking to a guy born in America for generations as a slave who was taught that he was a no good dumb nigger who shouldn't even learn how to read. Like the conversations probably the enlightening done by the guy who was born in Africa on the guy who was born as a slave, just the I'm sure there was a lots of teaching going back and forth.
Without a doubt. As you said, to be a shadow or a fly on the wall for any of it, that and this whole story is one of those you start to see because, as we said, imagine being these guys sitting here watching these soldiers coming down, beating drums with their guns ready to burn your shit down. And then you move past that and you realize news reached New Orleans super quick and the city immediately goes into lockdown. To see what that would have looked like. To see Governor William C. Claiborne freaking the fuck out. He is living in a nightmare scenario. If Deslandes' army reaches the city gates, the thousands of enslaved people inside New Orleans who outnumber the whites might join them. If that happens, the United States loses Louisiana. But Claiborne has a problem. He doesn't trust the local French or Creole militia because, as we mentioned, the Americans and the French elites hated each other. Hated each other. He is afraid the French might not fight hard enough for an American governor. Enter General Wade Hampton. Now, I know, it might sound familiar. No, he's not related to Fred Hampton. Get that the hell out of your mind because he had a grandson also named Wade Hampton who became a famous Confederate general later. The apple really doesn't fall far from the tree here. General Hampton is a career military man. He's a massive slaveholder himself as well. He also happens to be in New Orleans. He takes command. He gathers a force of regular U.S. Army troops and sailors from the USS Revenge, ironically enough. At the same time, Manuel Andre, the guy who escaped, has rallied a militia of angry planters on the other side of the uprising, upriver. They're setting a trap. Hampton is coming from New Orleans, moving upriver. Andre's militia is moving from the country, downriver. Deslandes and his army are in the middle. They're walking right into a pincer movement. This isn't a police action. It's about to become a military campaign. Good story needs one.
It is.
Just barely though, because I want to say Andrew Jackson was the 1820s, 1811. So it's just maybe a decade before, maybe 15 years before he really starts coming into power, I want to say.
Okay. Okay.
29 to 37. Sorry, that's when so it's about 18 years before Andrew Jackson comes into power. Wild, wild. And then you felt like the Roosevelts are related, but then if you can believe it, I don't know if you ever saw that article that there's this high school girl that was doing a report on genealogies and like she had her grandfather help her and they had other people corroborate it, but basically they broke down that like all but two presidents come from the same place in England, basically more or less. I'll
Yeah.
see if I can find that article and send it to you because it's like mind blown. Makes you think, man. It really does. And just like you said, very similar to Andrew Jackson for sure. And I think you can kind of see how he got voted president when you have guys like this running shop in some of the bigger cities. Just to have that money, man. Yeah. That's how you keep the bloodline pure, right? Quote unquote. Well, it's the same thing with all the kings and queens, right? That this way you don't have any riffraff coming into the blood, but it's like riffraff would probably have better genes than you guys do at this point. No doubt, man. No doubt. Well, doesn't have anything to do with getting jiggy with your sister, but I think you're going to enjoy where this story goes next. Now, okay, I know that wasn't our cleanest segue, but this isn't the cleanest story either. It's got a lot of blood and guts and whole bunch of horrible shit about to come our way. See, the collision happens between these forces on the morning of January 10th. The rebels have stopped at Jacques Fortier Plantation. They are possibly preparing to make a stand or resting before the final push to the city. They realize they're trapped, though. To their credit, they don't run immediately. They form up. They prepare to fight. But the technological disparity is just too huge. Deslandes has muskets, sure, but many of his men are armed with cane knives, axes, farm tools. Wade Hampton has artillery. He has professional soldiers with rifles. The battle is short. The U.S. troops unleash a volley of fire that breaks the rebel line. The rebels fight bravely. Cook and Quamana reportedly fought to the bitter end, but once the line breaks, it becomes a slaughter. Deslandes and his surviving men retreat into the swamps behind the plantations. And this is where the hunt begins. The militia, fueled by vengeance, fear, and let's be honest, probably a lot of alcohol, unleashes tracking dogs. They scour the cypress swamps. There is no mercy. Men are shot on sight. Many are captured specifically to be made examples of. The dream of the Black Republic on the Mississippi ends in the mud of the Louisiana swamp just 48 hours after it began.
Uh, well, I'll say one thing. Those were at least 2 full days from what you just said, where people were just left in suspense as far as what the hell is going to happen.
It may not seem like a lot in the grand scheme of things, but dude, like you were saying, can you imagine being a fly on the wall for that?
Mm-hmm. For a fact. For a fact. Yeah. Uh, Hell of a collision. I just love the fact that, not only is this on MLK Day, but the specific event that we're talking about is kind of close to the date that we're on now, January 10th.
And none of this was
Very,
planned out, people. Let me say that now. This was not intentional. This is just how sometimes that weird way of the world works.
oh yeah, I guess the universe is speaking to us, you know, uh But what if all in all, what can we say? Just like cocaine is one hell of a drug, rifles are one hell of a weapon.
Especially when compared to muskets, man. They didn't stand a chance. And rifles are even more of a hell of a weapon when compared to axes and farm tools.
Hmm. And while we're on this topic, what do you think of the saying, if all else fails, we have machine guns and they don't?
I think it speaks volumes to what you're seeing here. That honestly, if it was a level playing field, I think Deslandis's men would have been a lot harder to take down than they were in this battle.
Hmm. And while we're on this, I try not to always just praise certain historical figures, but to look at what they did wrong or could have did a little better in certain cases. And do you think in these cases that the men could have probably prepped themselves a little better as far as trying to get their hands on some real deal Holyfield artillery for the time?
I think it would have been a lot more difficult. Would it have been possible? It may have been possible, but I think for what they were wanting to do, I can't tell you, man. Like if Wade Hampton wasn't there in New Orleans, I think it would have been different. I think there were a lot of factors. Like I said, timing is everything. And I think the reason this was able to happen was greatly due to timing. But I think the reason it was shut down so superbly as well was thanks to timing. That had they had a few days, they might have gotten the ability to get some artillery of some sort. Or there may not have been any artillery there to stand against them. And then if they were able to free New Orleans, they could hole up in that city, shut the doors, and probably hold out a lot longer, and this story would have had a lot different of an ending than it does.
Yeah, just one of those things you have to mention because it just goes all across the board, like with any type of historical figure, like people talk about Napoleon as if not as if he was perfect as in the sense of a perfectly moral human being, but in the sense of he was just flawless in his strategies and shit like that. Like that motherfucker made some flaws and he had some flaws and mistakes to the way he executed things that led to his downfall in some cases. Like he wasn't perfect in any sense.
There's a
So,
reason he was stranded in Egypt.
like I said, just it's all about not just praising certain historical figures, like I said, and putting these motherfuckers in the pantheon of gods. Because it's like I say always, one aim of this show is to humanize historical figures. I feel.
100%. 100%. And It doesn't get more human and tragic than the closing chapters on this story because it doesn't end with a hunt in the swamp. This is where it turns from a war story into a horror movie. The white elites needed to reestablish dominance. They needed to make sure that no enslaved person ever thought about freedom again. How did they go about doing this? They set up a tribunal at the Destrehan plantation. This was basically kangaroo court. The verdicts were obviously predetermined. Charles Deslandes was captured. The reports of his death are gruesome and vary by account, but some say his hands were chopped off, his thighs were broken, and he was shot and burned. It was torture, plain and simple. But for the other leaders and participants, and this is going to sound very familiar to Stano, the punishment was decapitation. They cut off the heads of nearly 100 rebels. They placed these heads on tall wooden poles, pikes, just like Stano. And then, and this is the image history tries to scrub away, they planted these pikes along the levee of the Mississippi River for 60 miles, from the German coast all the way to the Place d'Armes, Jackson Square, in the French Quarter. There was a line of rotting heads. It was a river of heads. If you were traveling by boat to New Orleans, this was the first thing you saw. It was a grotesque billboard advertising American power. And here's the kicker. The territory of Louisiana paid the planters for their loss. They reimbursed owners $300 for every enslaved person executed. Now think about that. The government used tax money to pay planters for the quote unquote property they had to destroy to keep the system running.
Yeah, it's kind of reminiscent of when you said you think that some slaveholders would get it into their heads, hey, I could pay this dude like just a little slice off of my large loaf and not even have to enslave him and he'll do it just fine. You know, I probably don't have to go through with this. Like they'd rather go through with all that, you know,
Then
as
pay
opposed to,
basically fractions of a dollar.
yeah, as opposed to letting motherfuckers live free. It shows a system in place though. I'll say that much.
It
There
does.
was
And you start to see that system really solidify and how that system really goes on even past this because after the heads were taken down, a second violence occurred. That's the violence of silence. That sounds like a really killer emo band name, I know, but no. This is when the US government and the planter class tactily agreed to never speak of this again. They dismissed it in the newspapers as brigandage, just a few bandits acting crazy. They didn't want the North to know the plantation system was unstable. They didn't want other enslaved people to know an army had successfully formed. They buried the history. For 100 years, you couldn't find a mention of Deslandes in a textbook. It's only thanks to researchers like Gwendolyn Midlow Hall and the opening of the Whitney Plantation Museum that this story is being told properly. But there's a weird, beautiful cultural twist to the legacy. The German coast, the exact area of blood and sugar, later became a fertile ground for something else music. The 1811 Kid mentioned in some histories refers to Kid Ory, the legendary jazz trombonist who played with Louis Armstrong. Kid Ory was born on the Woodland Plantation. Do you know what the Woodland Plantation used to be called? The Andre Plantation. Kid Ory was born on the exact same soil where Manuel Andre was hacked with an axe and where the rebellion started. There is a direct line from the resistance and resilience of those enslaved warriors to the culture that eventually birthed jazz. The spirit of the German coast wasn't destroyed. It just changed form.
mm, well, if there's any type of sweet resolution you can get from a story like that, I guess that's it. Who that that's a delicate piece of history. I can't lie to you. I think that's one gem people will definitely take from this show if nothing else.
I like to hope so. I like to hope so. And sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really not trying to rush us on this. I've enjoyed our time together. And you know I always love chopping it up with my boy Talberto. But if I can go ahead and put my glasses on here, what have we learned today from the burning cane fields of 1811? We learned that the narrative we are often sold that slavery was accepted passively, or that resistance was rare, is a complete lie. We learned that Charles Deslandes and his army of 500 men didn't lose because they lacked courage. They lost because they were fighting the United States Army with farm tools. But mostly we learned that you can chop off 100 heads. You can put them on poles for 60 miles. And you can burn the court records, but you can't kill the truth. The German Coast Uprising wasn't a riot, it was a prologue. It was the first draft of a story that would eventually end with the Civil War. Deslandes didn't get his Black Republic, but he forced the United States to look in the mirror and see the monster it had created. And sometimes seeing the monster is the first step toward killing it. Take care of yourselves and each other. This has been Queso You Didn't Know. Mr. Talberto, any closing thoughts? Any closing things you'd like to plug? Anything at all, sir?
You know, as I always go, I'll end it off with some words of wisdom that kind of connect to what I said earlier. But smart people learn from their own mistake. Wise people learn from the mistakes of others. Try to be a little wise. But as always, world's most dangerous podcast. Believe the cheese. Tolbert Simpson is the Instagram handle, and just keep a lookout on the internet streets for you people. We're always here.